Okay, our next task is going to be to give our users the ability to log in. So we're going to create a login endpoint to allow our users to do that. And when a user logs in, we're going to have to compare their password with the password hash that we've saved inside our database. So below the register endpoint, let's just create another endpoint inside here. Let's just close the others, as I'm just working in the account controller at this time. So we're going to create another HTTP post, and we're going to give it a root parameter of login. And we'll say public async task, and we're going to once again return an action result of type app user, and we're going to call this endpoint login, and we're going to create a login DTO, which is also going to take the username and password. So let's create that now, and inside the DTOs folder, I'm going to add a new file that's going to be a class, and I'm going to call it login DTO. Technically, at the moment, we could use the register DTO as it's going to contain the same properties, but later on, we're going to want to take more information when a user registers, but not right now. But for the time being, we'll just create the login DTO separately. So we're going to take a string of their username, and we're going to take the string of their password. And once again, so that we deal with the nullable reference types, we're going to make sure that these are required. A user cannot log in if they're missing one of these properties anyway. So we'll say required, but we won't use the data annotations this time. And we'll go back to our account controller, and we'll say login DTO. And yeah, like I say, I'm probably going to forget to do this on a regular basis, but technically the namespace here should be DTOs. And I didn't do that for the register, but don't worry if I do miss this, as like I said, I'm not going to be using the same class names for anything that we create in this training course anyway. So I'm going to say login DTO, which is going to add the using statement for API DTOs, and I'm going to refer to it as login DTO inside this method. So when we log in, we're going to need to get our user from the database so that we can compare the password hash with the password they're providing in the body of the login request. So we'll start off by saying var user equals, and we'll say await and context dot users, and we've got various options for using where type queries in our database. We can use the where query if we wanted a list of users that meet a specified criteria. We can use many first options, first async, first or default async. And if we use this one, then if the user is not found, it's going to return the default value if that user is not found in our database. Now, the default value in this case would be null if the user does not exist in our database. If we use first async and our user doesn't exist, then this throws an exception. So we wouldn't typically use that one. We would use this one and then check to see if the user is null. We can also use single or default async, and this is going to find the only user that exists in a database. But if there's more than one element that matches in our database, then again this throws an exception. So just at the moment, I'm going to use first or default async that returns the first user in our database that matches a criteria, or it's going to return null. And first, single, they're going to do the same things at this stage. So we need to then say which user we want to get. So I'm going to say x goes to x.username. That's equal to the login DTO.username. Now, since we've specified that we're only saving our username, and let's move this down, since we've specified that our usernames are going to be converted to lowercase inside our database, then we just need to convert this one to lower so that we're matching like for like. So I'll specify to lower there. So that gives us our user, but it could be null, because if we hover over the user, then it says app user question mark, which means, yeah, sure, that could be null based on the return type of the first or default async. So we need to check for that. And we're going to say if user is equal to null, then we're just going to return unauthorized, because if their user is not in our database, then we can't let them log in. So I'm just going to say invalid username or password. Or let's be specific at this stage, just so that we're clear when we do see the errors in Postman, we know which part of the request it failed on. So following this, we need to compare the password in the database with what they've provided. And we're going to use HMAC again. So we'll add using var HMAC equals new HMAC SHA-512, but this time we're going to create it with the key. And this will allow us to compare like for like. So inside our database, we're storing the password salt, and that is the key that we supply to this method. That way, when we compute the hash, it's going to have the same hash as the one stored in the database. And below this, we'll say var computed hash equals hmac.compute hash, and then we need to add the encoding once again. So we'll say encoding .utf-8 and get bytes, and we'll say login DTO dot password. And then we need to compare the computed hash with the hash that we've stored in the database, and we're going to loop over this. So I'm going to add a for loop, and we've got a little snippet for this from VS Code. So I'll use a snippet, and we'll say for int I equals 0, whilst I is less than the computed hash dot length, and then we're going to use the incrementer of I++. So that changes I to 1, and then we compare 1 against the computed hash dot length, and then we increment again, and then I becomes 2, and so on and so forth. It's just a way of looping over the elements in the computed hash array, because this is an array of bytes. And then we're going to compare each element of the computed hash against what we've stored in our database. So we're going to say if, and then computed hash, and then to access the element at a particular index, we use square brackets and we specify I. And we're going to compare that against our user password hash, and we're going to check to see if that is not equal to user.password hash at the same index. And if that is not equal, we know the password doesn't match, so we can return unauthorized and say invalid password. And if they get past the for loop, then we know that they're authenticated, and we can return the user. So with our login method in place, we can go test, and let's just check the status of our API. And that doesn't look good at all. So let's just stop the API server from running. And that took a while to clear, but let's say .NET watch again, just to see if there's genuinely an issue. And this is one of the reasons I don't particularly like hot reloading with .NET Watch. It does get itself into a bit of a pickle every now and again, and we do find that we have to stop and then restart our API server probably more often, I would think, than before hot reloading was introduced into .NET. I did prefer it when it was just a simple file watcher that would restart our application when something changed, but it is what it is. And let's see, our application has started cleanly, so we can now test our ability to log in as a user. So I've got a request here in Postman to log in as Bob. Let's check the body of this request. The username is Bob, uppercase, with password of password. I think I have a user called Bob in my database, but let's just send this request and see what happens. And it says invalid username. And let me just double check the users that I do have. And I've got a Bob with a username there, but Bob with that username doesn't seem to have the password hash or password salt. And this one, we didn't convert this to lowercase, so this username will not be valid, because in our code, then we're comparing username, and in this case, Bob has a capital B, and then we're converting this to lowercase anyway, so that's comparing capital B Bob to lowercase b Bob. So that user isn't going to exist. So I'm just going to check with a user that I know does exist in the database because I created it very recently. And let's change Bob to Dave. And let's see if this one works. So I'll click send. And this time we get success because we're getting our user object back. And because of our logic, if I said Dave with a capital D and a capital A, then this one should also still work. And it does. And if I say Dave with the incorrect password, and I'll say password 1, and click send, then we get the invalid password. So that's what we're looking for right now. We've got our login functionality, and we've got the ability for our users to log in. But what we're returning from our API is not good. We would not want to return the password hash and the password salt every time a user logs in. And what we want to return to the user instead is a token. And we're going to use JSON Web Tokens as the method our users are going to use to authenticate to our API. And next we're going to discuss what they are, and then we'll go ahead and implement them.